The lingering questions about what exactly went on in those forgotten corners of the Manhattan Project, places that never truly shut down, continue to haunt us to this day. Did you know that some parts of the Manhattan Project never actually ended? We all know the story. Oppenheimer, Los Alamos, the Trinity Test, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the end of World War II, and seemingly the end of the race to build the bomb. But what if I told you that while the world celebrated peace, certain labs, certain projects continued in the shadows, evolving, adapting, and pushing the boundaries of nuclear science in ways we're only beginning to understand? We're not talking about Area 51 style conspiracy theories here, but about documented, albeit heavily obscured, facilities and research programs that quietly persisted for decades after the official conclusion of the Manhattan Project. Think about it. The knowledge gained, the infrastructure built, the scientific momentum achieved. It couldn't just vanish overnight. The Cold War was already brewing. A new kind of arms race was beginning, and the United States wasn't about to dismantle its nuclear advantage. So, while the public focused on mushroom clouds and the dawn of the atomic age, a dedicated group of scientists, engineers, and military personnel continued their work, refining existing weapons, exploring new applications of nuclear technology, and yes, even conducting experiments that raise serious ethical questions about the limits of scientific inquiry. These weren't just routine maintenance or stockpile management facilities. We're talking about advanced research labs, often tucked away in remote locations, operating under layers of secrecy and bureaucratic obfuscation. Places where the pursuit of scientific knowledge sometimes seemed to overshadow concerns about safety, environmental impact, and the long-term consequences of their actions. The official narrative tells us that the Manhattan Project achieved its goal, ending the war and ushering in a new era of global power dynamics. But the unofficial narrative, the one hidden in declassified documents, whispered the accounts of former employees and hinted at in the environmental legacy of these forgotten labs, paints a far more complex and unsettling picture. So, what exactly were they doing in these places? What kind of experiments were being conducted? And perhaps, most importantly, what are the lasting effects of these clandestine operations on our environment and our health? Today, we're diving deep into the untold story of the Manhattan Project, exploring the forgotten labs that never closed and uncovering the secrets that have been hidden in the shadows for far too long. We'll be looking at specific locations, declassified documents, and the testimonies of people who were involved to piece together a more complete and accurate picture of this crucial, yet often overlooked, chapter in nuclear history. Get ready to question everything you thought you knew about the dawn of the atomic age, because the truth is far more complicated and far more disturbing than the official story would have you believe. We're going beyond the familiar narratives of Oppenheimer and Los Alamos and venturing into the shadowy world of perpetual research, where the pursuit of scientific advancement sometimes came at a terrible cost. The story of the Manhattan Project didn't end in 1945. In many ways, it was just the beginning, and that beginning, for many, was a descent into a new kind of darkness. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, for example, wasn't simply dismantled after the war. While Los Alamos is often portrayed as the scientific heart of the project, Oak Ridge was its industrial engine, enriching the uranium that fueled the bombs. The vast K-25 gaseous diffusion plant, a behemoth stretching across the Tennessee landscape, continued to operate, albeit with a shifted focus. The Cold War demanded a constant supply of enriched uranium, and Oak Ridge became a crucial battleground in that silent war. But the expansion wasn't just about quantity. It was about pushing the boundaries of what was possible, exploring new isotopes, new methods of enrichment, and new applications for nuclear technology, many of which remain classified to this day. Imagine the scene. It's 1947. The war is over, but the atmosphere at Oak Ridge is anything but celebratory. The scientists, engineers, and technicians, many of whom had worked tirelessly for years in conditions of utmost secrecy, were now faced with a different kind of pressure. The pressure of maintaining America's nuclear supremacy. The pressure of knowing that their work held the fate of the world in the balance. The pressure of living with the ethical implications of what they had created. One such individual was Dr. Eleanor Vance, a brilliant physicist who had been recruited to Oak Ridge straight out of graduate school. She initially believed she was contributing to a noble cause, a necessary evil to end a global conflict. But as the years passed and the Cold War intensified, she began to question the relentless pursuit of ever more powerful weapons. It was like a treadmill, she confided in a series of interviews conducted decades later, interviews that were only recently declassified. We were constantly chasing the next breakthrough, the next advantage. There was never a moment to stop and ask ourselves if we were doing the right thing. Dr. Vance's work focused on the refinement of uranium isotopes, a process that involved exposing workers to significant levels of radiation. She witnessed firsthand the devastating effects of this exposure, the cancers, the illnesses, the premature deaths. And yet, the work continued, driven by the insatiable demands of the military-industrial complex. One day, while reviewing data from a series of experiments, Dr. Vance stumbled upon something unsettling. The results indicated that the particular isotope, one that was being considered for use in a new generation of nuclear reactors, had unexpectedly volatile properties. It was unstable, prone to spontaneous fission, and potentially dangerous. She immediately brought her concerns to her supervisor, Dr. Marcus Caldwell, a man whose ambition outweighed his ethical considerations. Caldwell dismissed her findings, accusing her of being overly cautious and hindering progress. "Eleanor, we're on the cusp of a major breakthrough here," he said, his voice laced with impatience. "We can't afford to get bogged down in theoretical risks. The Soviets aren't going to wait for us to dot every I and cross every T." Dr. Vance refused to back down. Dr. Vance refused to back down. She knew that the potential consequences of ignoring these anomalies were too severe. She argued with Caldwell, presenting her data, explaining the potential for catastrophic failures, but he remained unmoved. He saw her as an obstacle, a roadblock on his path to scientific glory. "Eleanor, I appreciate your diligence," he said, his tone condescending, "but I assure you, everything is under control. We have protocols in place. Now, I suggest you focus on your assigned tasks and leave the bigger picture to those of us who understand it." Eleanor was furious, but she knew that arguing further with Caldwell would be futile. He was too entrenched in his own self-importance to listen to reason. She realized that she needed to find someone who would take her concerns seriously, someone with the authority to intervene. But who could she trust? In this isolated world of secrets and paranoia, trust was a rare and precious commodity. She thought of Dr. Oppenheimer, the scientific director of the Manhattan Project. He was a brilliant and respected figure, but also a man burdened by the weight of the world. Would he be willing to listen to a junior scientist raising concerns about a relatively minor experiment? She knew it was a long shot, but she felt she had no other choice. Gathering her courage, Eleanor drafted a letter to Oppenheimer, outlining her findings and her concerns about the potential dangers of Caldwell's experiments. She carefully worded her letter, trying to convey the urgency of the situation without sounding alarmist or hysterical. She knew that Oppenheimer was a busy man, and she needed to make her case as clear and concise as possible. She knew that sending the letter was a risky move. Caldwell would undoubtedly be furious if he found out, and she could face serious repercussions. But she couldn't live with herself if she remained silent and something terrible happened. She had a responsibility to speak up, to protect the people and the environment from the potential dangers of these unchecked experiments. After carefully sealing the envelope, she slipped it into the outgoing mail slot, her heart pounding in her chest. Now all she could do was wait and hope that Oppenheimer would receive her letter and take her concerns seriously. The fate of the project, and perhaps the world, could very well hinge on his response. Days turned into weeks, and Eleanor heard nothing. She began to lose hope. Had her letter been intercepted? Had Oppenheimer dismissed her concerns as the ramblings of a paranoid scientist? She tried to focus on her work, but the anxiety gnawed at her, making it difficult to concentrate. Meanwhile, Caldwell continued his experiments, pushing the boundaries of what was known, driven by his insatiable desire for a breakthrough. He ignored the warning signs, dismissing the anomalies as mere statistical fluctuations. He was so close, he could feel it. He was on the verge of unlocking a new level of power, a power that would cement his place in history. One evening, as Eleanor was working late in the lab, she noticed a strange flickering in the equipment. The readings were spiking erratically, and the air was thick with a metallic tang. She immediately recognized the signs. The experiment was on the verge of going critical. She rushed to Caldwell's office, but he was nowhere to be found. Panic surged through her. She had to shut down the experiment, but she didn't know the proper procedures. Caldwell had kept the most critical information closely guarded, sharing it only with his trusted assistants. Desperate, Eleanor searched for the emergency shutdown protocols, but they were nowhere to be found. Caldwell had apparently removed them, fearing that someone might sabotage his work. She was on her own, with no guidance, no support, and the fate of the lab, and perhaps the world, resting on her shoulders. She knew she had to act quickly. The experiment was teetering on the brink of disaster, and every second counted. She began frantically flipping switches, pulling levers, and disconnecting wires, hoping to stumble upon the right combination that would shut down the reaction. The equipment continued to flicker and spark, and the air grew hotter and heavier. Eleanor could feel the radiation burning her skin. She knew that she was running out of time. Just as he was about to give up hope, she noticed a small, unlabeled switch hidden behind a panel. It was her last chance. With trembling hands, she flipped the switch. The lab plunged into darkness. The flickering stopped. The reading stabilized, and the metallic tang in the air began to dissipate. Eleanor had done it. She had averted a catastrophe. But the silence that followed was deafening. She didn't know what the long-term consequences of her actions would be, but she knew that she had bought them some time. Time to figure out what was really going on in this forgotten lab, and time to expose the truth, no matter how dangerous it might be. She had a feeling that this was only the beginning. The Forgotten Labs held secrets far darker than she could have ever imagined, and she was now caught in a web of intrigue and danger that would test her courage and her resolve to the limit. The fight for the truth had just begun, and Eleanor Vance was ready to face whatever lay ahead. The stakes were simply too high to ignore. "Did you see that? Did you see what she did?" Dr. Albright sputtered, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. "She actually dared to defy me. Seal off Sector Gamma. Now, I want that woman found and brought to me, and inform security to be ready with appropriate measures." The two technicians flanking him exchanged nervous glances. "Doctor, are you sure that's wise?" "She's Agent Vance. There will be questions." Albright rounded on them, his voice a venomous hiss. "Questions are for those who have the luxury of asking them. We don't have time for questions. Just do as I say. And someone get me Dr. Graham on the line. Immediately." Meanwhile, Eleanor, adrenaline still coursing through her veins, moved deeper into the labyrinthine corridors. The emergency doors she had sealed would hold them for a while, but she knew Albright wouldn't give up easily. She needed to find proof, something concrete that would expose his operation. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of information she had gathered. The strange energy readings, the modified equipment, the hushed conversations. It all pointed to something far beyond simple research. She paused at a junction, her hand resting on the cold metal of a doorframe. A soft hum emanated from the room beyond, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. Hesitantly, she pushed the door open, revealing a chamber filled with an array of complex machinery. Cables snaked across the floor, connecting to a central device that resembled a giant metallic cocoon. The air crackled with an almost palpable energy. A figure stood silhouetted against the glow of the machine, their back to Eleanor. "I was wondering when you'd arrive," a voice said, smooth and chillingly calm. "I expected you sooner, actually." Eleanor's hand instinctively moved towards her weapon. "Who are you? And what is this place?" The figure turned, revealing a face that was both familiar and unsettling. It was Dr. Graham, Albright's second in command, but there was a coldness in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. "This, Agent Vance, is the future. A future that you, unfortunately, will not be a part of." The air crackled with tension. Eleanor knew deep down that she had stumbled upon something far bigger, far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. This wasn't just about forgotten labs and lingering radiation. This was about a secret, a project that had been hidden in the shadows for decades, and Dr. Graham was its gatekeeper. "What are you talking about, Graham? What is this place?" Eleanor demanded, her voice steady despite the fear that was creeping into her mind. She scanned the room, taking in the strange equipment, the humming machines, the unnerving sense of sterile isolation. Graham chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "This, my dear, Agent Vance, is where the real work continued. While the rest of the world celebrated the end of the war, while they patted themselves on the back for stopping Hitler, we understood that the threat never truly disappeared. It merely evolved." He gestured towards one of the machines, a complex array of wires and tubes that pulsed with an eerie green light. This is Project Nightingale, our attempt to not just understand the atom, but to control it, to bend it to our will in ways that Oppenheimer and his team could only dream of. We're not just talking about bombs, Agent Vance. We're talking about energy, about medicine, about a future where humanity is no longer limited by the constraints of physics. Eleanor struggled to process what she was hearing. It sounded insane, a mad scientist's dream. But the coldness in Graham's eyes, the conviction in his voice, told her that he believed every word he was saying. And that made it all the more terrifying. But why keep it secret? Why not share this with the world? She asked, stalling for time, trying to figure out a way to escape this nightmare. Graham's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. Share it with the world? Agent Vance, you underestimate the dangers. This power in the wrong hands could destroy everything. We can't trust politicians. We can't trust the public. Only a select few, those who truly understand the implications, can be trusted with this knowledge. He paused, his gaze hardening. And you, Agent Vance, have proven that you cannot be trusted. You're too curious, too persistent. You ask too many questions. Eleanor knew what was coming. She had seen that look in men's eyes before. It was the look of someone who had made a decision that involved her elimination. So what happens now, Graham? You're going to kill me? She asked, trying to sound defiant, even though her heart was pounding in her chest. Not kill, Agent Vance, Graham corrected, his voice almost gentle. Eliminate. There's a difference. We're not murderers. We're guardians. We're protecting the future from those who would misuse it. He nodded to someone behind her, and Eleanor felt a sharp pain in her neck. A dart, she realized, filled with some kind of sedative. Her vision began to blur, and she struggled to stay conscious. You can't stop us, Agent Vance, Graham said, his voice fading in and out of focus. Project Nightingale will continue. The future will be ours. Eleanor's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor, her mind slowly slipping into darkness. As she lost consciousness, she saw a figure emerge from the shadows, a figure that she recognized but couldn't quite place. It was someone from her past, someone she thought she could trust. And that realization was the last thing she remembered before everything went black. Meanwhile, back in Washington, Caldwell was growing increasingly concerned. He hadn't heard from Eleanor in hours, and he knew that something was wrong. He tried to reach her again, but her phone went straight to voicemail. Damn it, he muttered, slamming his fist on the desk. He had a bad feeling about this, a feeling that Eleanor had stumbled upon something that she wasn't supposed to see. He knew that he had to do something, but he wasn't sure what. He couldn't just send in a team. That would only raise more questions and potentially expose the secret that had been buried for so long. He needed someone he could trust, someone who understood the stakes, someone who could operate outside the normal channels. He thought of Mark, the former agent who had helped Eleanor uncover the initial clues about the Forgotten Labs. He was a loose cannon, but he was also resourceful and loyal, and he owed Eleanor a debt. Caldwell picked up the phone and dialed Mark's number. I need your help, he said, his voice grim. Eleanor's gone missing, and I think it has something to do with the Manhattan Project. Mark didn't hesitate. Tell me where to go, he said, his voice equally serious. I'll find her. The game was on. The stakes were higher than ever, and the future of the world hung in the balance. But neither of them knew that the truth was far more complex and dangerous than they could possibly imagine, and that the secrets of the Manhattan Project were about to be unleashed upon the world in ways that no one could have predicted. The clock was ticking, and the race to uncover the truth had begun. She was last seen near Camp Hero, Montauk. You know, the old military base? There's a lot of weird stuff surrounding that place, Mark. Conspiracies, rumors, everything. David's voice was strained, laced with a fear that sent a shiver down Mark's spine. Camp Hero? Montauk? I've heard stories, Mark replied, remembering the countless late-night documentaries and internet forums filled with tales of clandestine experiments and government cover-ups. Time travel, mind control. You think that's got anything to do with Eleanor's disappearance? David sighed. I don't know what to think, Mark. All I know is that she was investigating something out there, something connected to her grandfather's work during the war. He was stationed at Brookhaven National Laboratory, and she was convinced he was involved in something more than just theoretical physics. Brookhaven. That's not too far from Montauk, Mark muttered, piecing together the fragments of information. Did she leave any notes? Anything that might give us a clue? Just this, David said, his voice barely above a whisper. A series of coordinates and a single word scrawled next to them. Chronos. Mark paused, the word hanging heavy in the air. Chronos, Greek for time. Interesting. Okay, David, send me everything you have. Every note, every email, every scrap of information. I'm heading to Montauk. Be careful, Mark, David pleaded. Please, this feels different, more dangerous than anything we've ever dealt with. I will, Mark promised, his mind already racing. I'll bring her home. He grabbed his go bag, the familiar weight a small comfort in the face of the unknown. As he walked out the door, he dialed a number on his phone. Sarah, I need your help. I'm going to Montauk, and I think we're about to uncover something big. Something very, very big. Sarah's voice crackled through the speaker. Montauk? What's going on, Mark? I've got a bad feeling about this. Eleanor's gone missing, he explained, quickly outlining the situation. And I think it's connected to the Manhattan Project, specifically something her grandfather was involved in at Brookhaven. The Manhattan Project? Again? Sarah sighed. This is getting ridiculous. Okay, I'm in. Send me the coordinates. I'll start digging into Brookhaven's archives. Mark sent the coordinates to Sarah, his mind racing. Eleanor missing. Caldwell stonewalling. Montauk. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite assemble. He glanced at the rain-streaked window, the storm outside mirroring the turmoil within him. He had to find Eleanor, and he had to uncover the truth, no matter how deeply buried it might be. Meanwhile, Eleanor found herself in a situation that grew more surreal with each passing moment. The room she was in, deep beneath the Montauk facility, hummed with an almost palpable energy. It was filled with equipment she couldn't identify, strange consoles with blinking lights, and wires that snaked across the floor like metallic vines. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and something else, something indefinable, almost alien. Caldwell stood beside her, his face an unreadable mask. Welcome, Dr. Vance, he said, his voice devoid of warmth. I trust your involuntary journey was not too unpleasant. Eleanor glared at him, Where am I? What is this place, and what do you want? Caldwell chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Patience, Dr. Vance. All will be revealed in due time. Let's just say that you possess certain aptitudes that are of great interest to us. Aptitudes that perhaps run in your family. He gestured to a large, circular device in the center of the room. It resembled a particle accelerator, but far more complex and imposing. A shimmering field of energy crackled within its core. This, Dr. Vance, is the culmination of decades of research. Research that began with your grandfather's work during the Manhattan Project. He laid the foundation, and we have built upon it. Built what? Eleanor demanded, her voice trembling slightly. What is this thing? This, Caldwell said, his eyes gleaming with fanaticism, is a bridge to other possibilities, other realities. Eleanor stared at him, disbelief warring with a growing sense of dread. You're insane. You can't be serious. This is just some science fiction fantasy. Is it? Caldwell raised an eyebrow. Consider the evidence, Dr. Vance. Consider the anomalies you yourself have observed. Consider the fact that you are standing here, in this place, witnessing this marvel. He stepped closer to the device, his hand hovering over a control panel. Your grandfather, he understood the potential. He saw the possibilities, but he lacked the vision, the courage to pursue them to their ultimate conclusion. We do not share his reservations. What are you going to do? Eleanor asked, her voice barely a whisper. We are going to open a door, Dr. Vance, Caldwell said, his voice filled with a chilling anticipation. A door to a new era, an era of limitless possibilities. He pressed a button on the control panel. The device hummed louder, the energy field within its core intensifying. The air crackled with electricity. Eleanor felt a strange tingling sensation all over her body. What's happening? She cried out. The process has begun, Caldwell said, his eyes fixed on the device. Soon, we will know the answers to questions that have plagued humanity for centuries. Suddenly, a voice boomed through the room, cutting through the humming of the device and Caldwell's pronouncements. That's far enough, Caldwell. Mark burst into the room, Sarah right behind him. They both held weapons, pointed directly at Caldwell. Mark! Sarah! Eleanor exclaimed, relief flooding through her. Caldwell turned, a look of annoyance on his face. How did you find us? It doesn't matter. You're too late. We'll see about that, Mark said, his voice grim. Eleanor, get away from him. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She moved quickly towards Mark and Sarah, putting as much distance as possible between herself and Caldwell. You don't understand, Caldwell said, his voice rising in desperation. This is for the good of humanity. We can unlock secrets that will change the world. You're going to destroy the world, Sarah retorted. That thing is unstable. You're playing with forces you can't control. Caldwell ignored her, his attention focused on the device. He continued to manipulate the controls, the energy field within the core growing more and more erratic. Stop him, Mark, Eleanor shouted. He's going to do something terrible. Mark nodded, his face set in determination. He raised his weapon, aiming it at Caldwell. But before he could fire, the device emitted a blinding flash of light. The room was filled with a deafening roar. The energy field within the core of the device exploded outwards, engulfing everything in its path. Mark, Sarah, and Eleanor were thrown backwards, slammed against the wall by the force of the blast. Caldwell was caught in the full brunt of the explosion, his body disappearing in a flash of light. When the dust settled, the room was a scene of devastation. The device was shattered, its components scattered across the floor. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of ozone. Mark, Sarah, and Eleanor lay on the floor, dazed and disoriented. They slowly picked themselves up, checking for injuries. What just happened? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. I don't know, Mark said, his eyes wide with shock. But I don't think it's good. Eleanor looked around the room, her heart pounding in her chest. Caldwell was gone. The device was destroyed. But something felt wrong, terribly wrong. We have to get out of here, she said, her voice urgent. Now! They stumbled out of the room, making their way through the labyrinthine corridors of the Montauk facility. As they ran, they could feel the ground shaking beneath their feet. The entire facility seemed to be on the verge of collapse. They finally reached the surface, emerging into the stormy night. The rain was still falling, but the wind had died down. They looked back at the Montauk facility, a dark and imposing silhouette against the stormy sky. What do we do now? Sarah asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to collect her thoughts. We have to figure out what Caldwell was trying to do, she said, and we have to stop it before it's too late. Mark nodded, his face grim. Where do we start? Eleanor looked out at the storm-tossed sea, her mind racing. We start with my grandfather, she said. We start with the Manhattan Project. They knew that the answers they sought were buried deep within the secrets of the past. And they knew that finding those answers would be a dangerous and perilous journey. But they were determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The fate of the world might depend on it. The storm raged on, mirroring the chaos and uncertainty that lay ahead. They had opened a door to something unknown, something terrifying. And now they had to find a way to close it. Eleanor's disappearance cast a long shadow over everything. Mark felt a knot of guilt tighten in his stomach. He had encouraged her, pushed her to dig deeper, and now she was gone. He had to find her, and he had to find out what Caldwell was hiding. He knew that Sarah would be running the coordinates he sent, trying to pinpoint Eleanor's last known location. But he couldn't just sit and wait. He needed to do something, anything. He decided to go back to the abandoned lab, the one where Eleanor had first discovered the anomalies. Maybe there was something there, some clue she had missed, something that could lead him to her. The drive was tense, the wipers working overtime to clear the torrential rain. The roads were slick and the visibility was poor, but Mark pushed on, his mind focused on Eleanor. He replayed their last conversation in his head, searching for any detail, any hint that could explain what had happened. He remembered her excitement, her determination, but also the underlying sense of unease she had felt. She had been close to something, he was sure of it. Something that Caldwell didn't want her to find. When he finally arrived at the lab, the scene was even more desolate than he remembered. The rain lashed against the crumbling walls, and the wind howled through the broken windows. The air was thick with the smell of damp concrete and decay. He pulled out his flashlight and stepped inside, the beam cutting through the darkness. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the sound of the rain and the occasional creak of the building, settling. He started his search, methodically going through each room, each corridor, looking for anything out of the ordinary. He checked the files, the equipment, the notes that Eleanor had left behind. He found nothing new, nothing that could explain her disappearance. Frustration began to creep in. He was running out of time. He knew that Caldwell wouldn't sit idly by while he investigated. He had to find something, and he had to find it fast. As he was about to give up, he noticed something he had missed before. A small, almost imperceptible scratch on the floor, near one of the old workbenches. He knelt down and examined it more closely. It looked like someone had dragged something heavy across the floor. He followed the scratch marks, and they led him to a hidden door, concealed behind a panel in the wall. He hesitated for a moment, then reached out and pulled the panel open. Behind the door was a narrow staircase, leading down into darkness. He took a deep breath and started to descend, his flashlight illuminating the way. The air grew colder and damper as he went down, and the smell of decay became even stronger. He could hear the sound of water dripping somewhere below. He had no idea what he would find down there, but he knew that he had to keep going. Eleanor was counting on him. Meanwhile, Sarah was working tirelessly at her computer, trying to trace Eleanor's signal. The coordinates Mark had sent pointed to a remote area near Montauk, but the signal was weak and intermittent. It was like someone was deliberately trying to jam it. She used every tool at her disposal, filtering out the noise, enhancing the signal, trying to get a clear fix on Eleanor's location. She knew that time was of the essence. The longer Eleanor was missing, the less likely it was that she would be found safe. She finally managed to get a lock on the signal, and her heart sank. The signal was coming from deep underground, from a location that didn't appear on any maps. It was as if Eleanor had been taken to a place that didn't exist. She cross-referenced the coordinates with historical records, geological surveys, anything that could give her a clue as to what was down there. She found nothing. The area was a blank spot on the map, a void in the data. She knew that she had to tell Mark, but she didn't want to distract him from his search. She decided to send him a coded message, a set of coordinates that he would recognize. She knew that he would understand what it meant. She just hoped that he could get to Eleanor in time. Back in the abandoned lab, Mark reached the bottom of the staircase. He found himself in a long, narrow tunnel, the walls lined with damp concrete. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic and acrid. He followed the tunnel, his flashlight beam dancing along the walls. He could hear the sound of machinery humming in the distance. He was getting closer to something. He could feel it. The tunnel opened into a large chamber, filled with strange equipment and machinery. He saw rows of metal tanks connected by a maze of pipes and wires. There were control panels with flashing lights and dials. The air was filled with a low, pulsating hum. He had never seen anything like it before. It looked like something out of a science fiction movie. In the center of the chamber, he saw Eleanor. She was tied to a chair, her eyes closed. She looked pale and weak. Standing beside her was Caldwell. He was wearing a lab coat and a smug expression on his face. He turned to Mark and smiled. "Welcome," he said. "I've been expecting you." Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He knew that he was walking into a trap, but he had no choice. He had to save Eleanor. He took a step forward, his hand reaching for the gun in his pocket. "Let her go, Caldwell," he said. "This ends now." Caldwell laughed. "It's too late for that," he said. "She knows too much. And now, so do you." He gestured to the machinery around them. "This is the future, Mark, a future that you can't comprehend." He continued, his voice rising in intensity. "We're on the verge of a breakthrough that will change the world. A breakthrough that will make the Manhattan Project look like child's play." Mark glared at him, his grip tightening on the gun. "You're insane," he said. "You're playing with forces you don't understand." Caldwell shook his head. "I understand perfectly," he said. "I'm the only one who does." He paused and added with a chilling smile, "And now you're going to be a part of it." He snapped his fingers and two figures emerged from the shadows. They were wearing lab coats and carrying weapons. They moved towards Mark, their faces expressionless. He knew that he was outnumbered, outgunned, but he wasn't going to give up without a fight. He had come too far to back down now. He had to save Eleanor and he had to stop Caldwell from unleashing whatever madness he had planned. The fate of the world might depend on it. The confrontation was inevitable, a clash between the past and a terrifying future. The figures approached, their movements precise, almost robotic. Mark braced himself, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He knew he couldn't take them both head on. He needed a distraction, an opening. He scanned the cluttered storage room, his eyes darting from shelf to shelf, searching for anything he could use. A stack of metal canisters caught his attention. They looked heavy, potentially explosive if he could find a way to ignite them. It was a long shot, but it was the only chance he had. He feigned a stumble, dropping to one knee and clutching his ankle. "Damn it!" he yelled, hoping to draw their attention. It worked. The figures paused, their expressionless faces tilting slightly. One of them moved closer, raising his weapon. "Stay where you are," he commanded, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. Mark used the distraction to reach for the canisters. He grabbed two, hefting them in his hands. They were heavier than he expected. "What do you want?" he asked, trying to buy himself some time. "Where's Eleanor?" The figure ignored his questions. "You're interfering with things you don't understand," he said. "Things that are beyond your comprehension." Mark smirked. "That's what they always say, isn't it? But I think I understand perfectly. You're trying to reopen Pandora's box, and you don't care who gets hurt in the process." The figure didn't respond. He simply raised his weapon again. Mark knew he was out of time. He hurled one of the canisters at the figure, aiming for his head. The figure ducked, and the canister slammed into a nearby shelf, sending a shower of debris crashing to the floor. The second figure opened fire. Mark dove behind a stack of crates, bullets whizzing past his head. He felt a sharp pain in his arm. He had been hit. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the pain. He had to keep moving. He had to keep fighting. He crawled through the maze of crates, using them as cover. He could hear the figures moving closer, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. He knew he couldn't stay hidden for long. He needed a way out, a way to escape. He spotted a narrow opening in the wall, barely wide enough for him to squeeze through. It looked like a ventilation shaft. It was a risky move, but it was his only hope. He scrambled towards the opening, ignoring the searing pain in his arm. He squeezed through the narrow space, scraping his skin against the rough metal. he found himself in a dark, dusty tunnel. He crawled forward, pushing through the darkness. He didn't know where it led, but it had to be better than staying in that storage room. He could hear the figures shouting behind him. They were trying to follow him. He had to keep moving. Meanwhile, Sarah was racing against the clock. She had received Mark's coordinates and was speeding towards Montauk, her mind filled with dread. She knew that something terrible was happening, and she was determined to stop it. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. The rain was coming down in sheets, making it difficult to see. But she pressed on, her foot heavy on the accelerator. As she approached Montauk, she noticed a strange glow emanating from the abandoned military base. It was an eerie, unnatural light, pulsating with an otherworldly energy. Her heart sank. She knew that whatever Caldwell was doing, it was far worse than she had imagined. She pulled up to the gates of the base, her headlights cutting through the darkness. The gates were locked, but she wasn't going to let that stop her. She reached into her trunk and pulled out a pair of bolt cutters. She quickly snipped through the lock and the gates swung open. She drove onto the base, her eyes scanning the deserted buildings. The air was thick with a strange metallic smell. She parked her car near the main building and stepped out, her hand resting on the gun holstered at her hip. She could feel the energy emanating from the building, drawing her in. She approached the entrance cautiously, her senses on high alert. The door was unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The building was dark and silent, except for a faint humming sound that seemed to be coming from deep within. She pulled out her flashlight and shined it down the hallway. She saw a series of doors, each marked with a different symbol. She recognized some of the symbols from Eleanor's research. They were related to the Manhattan Project. She moved down the hallway, checking each door. Most of the rooms were empty, filled with rusted equipment and decaying documents. But one room was different. It was brightly lit, and she could hear voices coming from inside. She pressed her ear against the door, trying to make out what they were saying. She heard Caldwell's voice, and another voice she didn't recognize. They were talking about something called Project Phoenix. She knew she had to get inside. She kicked the door open and burst into the room, her gun drawn. Caldwell and another man were standing in front of a large machine, surrounded by flashing lights and sparking wires. They both turned to face her, their faces filled with surprise. "Sarah," Caldwell said, his voice calm, "I was wondering when you'd show up." The other man raised his weapon. "Don't move," he commanded. Sarah ignored him. "What is this, Caldwell?" she demanded. "What are you doing?" Caldwell smiled. "I'm about to change the world, Sarah," he said, "and you're going to be a part of it." His words hung in the air, heavy with menace, as the machine began to hum louder, its energy crackling around them, a prelude to something terrifying. "Don't listen to him, Sarah. He's gone mad," the other man shouted, his voice strained. Sarah kept her eyes locked on Caldwell, her mind racing. What was he planning? What was this machine capable of? "Mad? No, my dear Thompson. I'm merely enlightened," Caldwell replied, his eyes gleaming with fanaticism. "I've seen the potential, the power that was buried here, forgotten by everyone else. But not me. I saw it, I understood it, and now I will unleash it." He gestured towards the machine with a flourish. "This, Sarah, is Project Kronos. A way to manipulate time itself. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Time manipulation. It was the stuff of science fiction, the kind of theoretical physics that existed only in textbooks. But here it was, a reality, or at least Caldwell's version of it. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You're going to tamper with time? You have no idea what kind of consequences that could have." Caldwell chuckled. Consequences. That's what the short-sighted always say. They're afraid of progress, of the unknown. But Sarah, I embrace it. I see the potential for a better world, a world free from the mistakes of the past. And who gets to decide what those mistakes are, Caldwell? You? Thompson interjected, his grip tightening on his weapon. This is insane. We have to stop him. Caldwell ignored Thompson, his gaze fixed on Sarah. Imagine, Sarah, the power to undo the horrors of war, to prevent tragedies, to rewrite history itself. We could create a utopia. Utopia built on lies and manipulation, Sarah countered. You can't just erase the past, Caldwell. It's what makes us who we are. And who are you to decide what should be erased? The machine hummed louder, the lights flashing more intensely. The air crackled with energy. Caldwell's eyes gleamed with fanaticism. I am the architect of a better future, Sarah. A future free from the pain and suffering of the past. He reached for the final control, his finger hovering over the activation button. Any last words? Sarah glared at him defiant. You're making a mistake, Caldwell. A terrible mistake. Mark knew he had to act fast. He lunged forward, tackling Caldwell just as he pressed the button. The machine sputtered, sparks flying as Caldwell fell against the control panel. Alarms blared, filling the room with a deafening screech. The figures in black, momentarily stunned, turned their attention to Mark. Thompson, seeing his opportunity, grabbed one of the weapons and aimed it at the other figure. Get out of here, Sarah. I'll cover you. Sarah hesitated, torn between helping Thompson and escaping. But she knew that staying would only put them all in more danger. She turned and ran, disappearing into the maze of corridors. Mark wrestled with Caldwell, trying to disarm him. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and burning metal. The machine was going haywire, its energy fluctuating wildly. You can't stop me, Caldwell shouted, his face contorted with rage. This is bigger than you can possibly imagine. Mark landed a blow to Caldwell's jaw, knocking him unconscious. He then turned his attention to the figures in black. Thompson was holding his own, but he was clearly outmatched. Mark grabbed a metal pipe from the floor and joined the fight. Together, they managed to subdue the remaining figures, tying them up with electrical cables. We need to get out of here, Mark said, panting. This place is about to blow. Thompson nodded. I'm right behind you. They raced through the corridors, following Sarah's path. The building shook violently as they ran, debris falling from the ceiling. They finally reached the exit, bursting out into the pouring rain. They turned to watch as the building behind them exploded in a massive fireball, lighting up the night sky. Sarah emerged from the shadows, her face pale but relieved. Are you both okay? We're alive, Mark said, but I don't think we're safe yet. Caldwell was still out there, and he wouldn't give up easily. And what about Eleanor? Was she still alive? And what was the true purpose of this forgotten lab? The answers were still shrouded in mystery, but one thing was clear. They had stumbled upon a conspiracy that reached far beyond the walls of Montauk. They had to find Eleanor, expose Caldwell, and stop him from unleashing his twisted vision of utopia upon the world. The rain continued to fall, washing away the debris and the secrets of the past, but the memories of what they had witnessed would forever be etched in their minds. They knew that their lives would never be the same again. They had opened a door to a world of unimaginable power and unspeakable danger, and there was no turning back. They had to face the consequences of their actions, and they had to do it together. The fight for the future had just begun. The Humvee roared to life, its headlights cutting through the downpour as they sped away from the crumbling facility. Sarah gripped the dashboard, her knuckles white. "Where to now?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the engine's din. "We need to find somewhere safe, somewhere we can regroup and plan our next move," Ben replied, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I know a place, an old safe house my grandfather used back in the day. It's secluded, off the grid. Caldwell won't think to look for us there." The drive was tense, each mile feeling like an eternity. The storm raged on, mirroring the turmoil within them. They spoke little, each lost in their own thoughts, grappling with the enormity of what they had uncovered. The images of the experiments, the whispers of forbidden knowledge, and the chilling presence of Caldwell haunted their minds. Finally, after hours of driving, they arrived at their destination, a dilapidated cabin nestled deep within the woods. It was rustic, almost forgotten, but it offered a sense of security, a temporary respite from the storm. "Home sweet home," Ben said wryly as he unlocked the door, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the cabin was musty and cold, but it was dry. They quickly set about making it habitable, lighting a fire in the hearth and gathering blankets. As the flames crackled to life, casting dancing shadows on the walls, a sense of warmth and hope began to flicker within them. "So what's the plan?" Sarah asked, settling onto a worn armchair. Ben paced the room, his brow furrowed in thought. "We need to figure out what Caldwell is planning, how far he's willing to go. And more importantly, we need to find Eleanor. She's the key to stopping him." "But how do we find her?" Mark interjected, his voice laced with concern. "Caldwell has resources, connections. We're just 3 people, armed with nothing but a few scraps of information." "We're not just 3 people," Ben countered, his eyes flashing with determination. "We're the only ones who know the truth. And we have something Caldwell doesn't, a conscience." He paused, his gaze sweeping across their faces. "We need to use what we learned at Montauk to our advantage. We know about the experiments, the technology. We can use that knowledge to track Caldwell, to anticipate his moves." They spent the next few hours poring over the documents they had salvaged from the lab, piecing together fragments of information, trying to make sense of Caldwell's twisted vision. They discovered that Eleanor had been instrumental in developing the technology that Caldwell was now weaponizing. She had been his protégé, his confidant, but something had gone wrong. She had seen the darkness within him, the potential for destruction, and she had tried to stop him. That's why he had imprisoned her, silenced her. "We need to find Eleanor," Sarah said, her voice tight with determination. "If anyone knows how to stop Caldwell, it's her." "But where do we even begin?" David asked, running a hand through his hair in frustration. This place is a maze, and we have no idea where she might be held. Think like Caldwell, Ben suggested, his eyes scanning the blueprints of the facility. Where would he keep someone who could potentially sabotage his plans? Somewhere secure, somewhere isolated, somewhere he could control her every move. They studied the blueprints, their fingers tracing the lines of the underground complex. A section labeled Sublevel 4 Containment caught their attention. It was a heavily fortified area, far removed from the main laboratories and living quarters. That's it, Sarah said, pointing to the section. That's where he'd keep her. But how do we get there? David asked. It's locked down, and we're not exactly equipped for a frontal assault. Ben smiled grimly. We're not going to assault it. We're going to outsmart it. Remember those neural interface devices we found? Caldwell was using them to control his subjects. I bet he's using something similar to keep Eleanor subdued. So, what are you suggesting? Sarah asked, her brow furrowed in thought. We use the devices to disrupt the signal, Ben explained. Overload the system. Create a diversion. It will give us the window we need to get to her. It's risky, David cautioned. We don't know the full extent of Caldwell's control. We could end up making things worse. We don't have a choice, Mark said, his voice firm. Eleanor's life is on the line. We have to try. He looked at Sarah, his eyes pleading. Are you with me? Sarah met his gaze, her expression resolute. Always. The next few hours were a blur of frantic activity. Mark, Ben, and David worked tirelessly, modifying the neural interface devices they had recovered from the abandoned labs. They scavenged parts, rewired circuits, and wrote new code, pushing the technology to its limits. Sarah, meanwhile, focused on analyzing the schematics of the Montauk facility, searching for weaknesses, for vulnerabilities they could exploit. I think I've found something, she announced, her voice strained with excitement. There's a secondary power conduit that runs directly to the control room. It's not heavily guarded, and it seems to be connected to the neural network. Perfect, Ben said, a grin spreading across his face. We can use that to inject our modified signal. It'll be like a Trojan horse, slipping right past Caldwell's defenses. But it's still a gamble, David cautioned. If we're wrong, we could trigger a failsafe, or even worse, amplify Caldwell's control. We know, Mark said, his voice grim, but we have to take the chance. As they prepared for the final assault, Mark couldn't shake the feeling of dread that gnawed at him. He knew that they were walking into a trap, that Caldwell was waiting for them. But he also knew that he couldn't abandon Eleanor. He owed her that much at least. They moved under the cover of darkness, navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the Montauk facility. The air was thick with anticipation, the silence broken only by the rhythmic thump of their boots on the concrete floor. They reached the secondary power conduit without incident, slipping past the few guards stationed there with ease. Ben connected the modified neural interface device to the conduit, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He initiated the program, sending a surge of energy through the network. The lights flickered, the monitors went haywire, and a low hum filled the air. It's working, Ben said, his voice barely above a whisper. The signal is disrupting Caldwell's control, but it's not enough. We need more power. I'm on it, Sarah said, rerouting the facility's main power supply to the secondary conduit. The lights flickered again, then stabilized, burning brighter than before. The hum intensified, vibrating through the walls. Suddenly, alarms blared, red lights flashing throughout the facility. Caldwell's voice echoed over the intercom, cold and menacing. Intruders detected. Lockdown initiated. All personnel report to your stations. He knows we're here, David said, his voice tight with fear. We don't have time for this, Mark said, grabbing his weapon. We have to move now. They raced towards the control room, their hearts pounding in their chests. They could hear the sounds of guards converging on their location, the click of weapons being cocked. They were running out of time. They reached the control room door, bracing themselves for a firefight. But when they burst through the door, they found the room empty. The monitors were still displaying chaotic data, the light still flickering, but Caldwell was nowhere to be seen. Where is he? Sarah asked, her eyes darting around the room. I don't know, Mark said, his voice laced with suspicion. But I have a feeling he's not far away. Suddenly the ground began to shake, the walls to tremble. A deep rumbling sound filled the air, growing louder and louder. What's happening? David asked, his voice filled with a panic. I think, Ben said, his face pale with fear. I think we just triggered something we shouldn't have. A section of the wall slid open, revealing a dark, gaping hole. A wave of cold air rushed out, carrying with it a sense of dread that chilled Mark to the bone. Eleanor, Mark whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of hope and fear. He knew, deep down, that whatever was behind that wall, it held the key to finding her. And he was ready to face it, no matter the cost. The fate of Eleanor and perhaps the world hung in the balance, and he knew that their journey had just taken a turn into the truly unknown. Sarah, ever the pragmatist, immediately pulled out her flashlight, its beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. Mark, stay close. Let's see what we're dealing with. The tunnel beyond the wall was narrow, barely wide enough for two people to walk side by side. The air grew colder and a faint metallic scent filled the nostrils, like ozone mixed with old blood. Water dripped from the ceiling, each drop echoing eerily in the confined space. Anything? Mark asked, his voice tight. Sarah swept the flashlight beam across the walls. Concrete reinforced with something. I can't quite make it out. Some kind of mesh and symbols. Look. Etched into the concrete, barely visible in the dim light, were a series of symbols. They were unlike anything Mark had ever seen. A strange combination of geometric shapes and what looked like stylized representations of atomic structures. What do they mean? Mark asked, his brow furrowed. I have no idea, Sarah admitted, but they're definitely not random. Someone put them here for a reason. They continued deeper into the tunnel, the silence broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the dripping water. The metallic scent grew stronger, and Mark could feel a tingling sensation on his skin. Suddenly, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. The air here was even colder, and the metallic scent was almost overpowering. In the center of the chamber stood a massive machine, its purpose utterly incomprehensible. It was a tangle of wires, tubes, and metal components, humming with a low, almost imperceptible vibration. Strange lights flickered across its surface, casting eerie shadows on the walls. What is that thing? Mark breathed, his eyes wide with disbelief. Sarah approached the machine cautiously, shining her flashlight on its various components. I I don't know. It looks like some kind of experimental reactor, but unlike anything I've ever seen. The technology is decades ahead of its time. As she circled the machine, she noticed a small panel on its side. It was covered in the same strange symbols that they had seen in the tunnel. There's something here, she said, reaching out to touch the panel. Don't, Mark shouted, but it was too late. As Sarah's fingers made contact with the panel, the machine roared to life. The lights flickered brighter. The humming intensified, and a wave of energy pulsed through the chamber. Mark felt a sharp pain in his head, and he stumbled backward, clutching his temples. "Sarah!" he cried, but she didn't respond. She stood frozen in place, her eyes wide and unseeing. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the machine fell silent. The lights dimmed, the humming faded, and the energy dissipated. Sarah slumped to the ground, unconscious. Mark rushed to her side, checking for a pulse. It was faint, but there. He breathed a sigh of relief. He had to get her out of here, and he had to find Eleanor. He looked around the chamber, his eyes scanning for any clue, any indication of where she might be. The room was eerily silent, the only sound his own ragged breathing. He noticed a small door tucked away in a corner, almost hidden behind a stack of crates. He hadn't seen it before. Could that be where Eleanor was? He cautiously approached the door, his hand reaching for the handle. It was cold and metallic, and it turned with a click. He hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room beyond was small and dimly lit, illuminated by a single flickering bulb. It looked like some kind of storage room, filled with shelves stacked high with boxes and equipment. But something felt off. The air was thick with a strange metallic smell, and there was a faint humming sound that seemed to vibrate through the floor. He took a step further into the room, his eyes scanning the shelves. And then he saw it. In the center of the room, bathed in the flickering light, was a large metal cylinder. It was about 10 feet tall and 5 feet wide, with a series of pipes and wires running along its surface. It looked like some kind of experimental device, something that shouldn't exist. And then he saw the inscription etched into the side of the cylinder. It read, Project Nightingale. His blood ran cold. Project Nightingale. He had heard whispers about it, rumors about a secret project that was even more dangerous than the Manhattan Project. A project that involved manipulating the human mind, controlling thoughts and emotions. He suddenly understood what Caldwell was trying to do. He wasn't just trying to create a better future. He was trying to control it. He was trying to create a world where everyone was subservient to his will. And then he saw Eleanor. She was strapped to a chair in front of the cylinder, her eyes closed, her head lolling to one side. She was unconscious. He rushed to her side, his heart pounding in his chest. "Eleanor!" he cried, shaking her gently. "Eleanor! Wake up!" Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked at him with a confused expression. "Mark," she said, her voice weak. "What's going on?" "Caldwell," he said, his voice grim. "He's using this machine to control people's minds. He's trying to control the world." Eleanor's eyes widened in horror. "We have to stop him," she said, struggling against the restraints. "We have to destroy this machine." "I know," Mark said, his eyes hardening. "But first, we have to get you out of here." He began to work on the straps, his fingers fumbling with the buckles. They were tight and secure, but he finally managed to loosen them enough to free her. "Thank you," Eleanor said, rubbing her wrists. "I don't know what he was doing to me, but it felt awful." "We'll talk about it later," Mark said, his eyes fixed on the cylinder. "Right now, we need to focus on destroying this thing." He looked around the room, searching for something he could use as a weapon. He grabbed a heavy wrench from a nearby shelf and handed it to Eleanor. "Here," he said. "Take this. We're going to need it." Eleanor took the wrench, her eyes filled with determination. "Let's do it," she said. Together, they approached the cylinder, their hearts pounding in their chests. They knew that this was their last chance to stop Caldwell, to save the world from his twisted vision. They raised their weapons and prepared to strike, ready to face whatever horrors lay ahead. As they stood there, bracing themselves for the fight, a sudden alarm blared through the facility, and the lights began to flash red. Something was about to happen, and they had no idea what it was. This was far from over, and they knew it. It was only just beginning, really. The alarm's shrill cry echoed through the cavernous chamber, bouncing off the cold metal walls and amplifying the dread that already gripped Sarah and Ben. Red lights pulsed rhythmically, casting long distorted shadows that danced around them like malevolent spirits. The air crackled with an almost palpable energy, a sense of impending doom that sent shivers down their spines. "What's happening?" Ben shouted over the din, his voice tight with anxiety. Sarah shook her head, her eyes darting around, searching for any clue, any indication of what was about to unfold. "I don't know, but it can't be good." The metallic cylinder in front of them began to hum, a low, resonant vibration that intensified with each passing second. Small vents hissed, releasing plumes of vapor that swirled around its base, obscuring it in an eerie mist. The humming grew louder, morphing into a high-pitched whine that strained their ears. Suddenly, the floor beneath them began to tremble. Not a gentle tremor, but a violent, earth-shaking shudder that threatened to knock them off their feet. Cracks spiderwebbed across the concrete, and dust rained down from the ceiling. "Earthquake!" Ben yelled, struggling to maintain his balance. "I don't think so," Sarah replied, her voice strained. "This feels different." The cylinder was now vibrating so intensely that it was almost a blur. The vents were spewing out clouds of vapor, and the air around it shimmered with heat. A low, guttural growl emanated from within the machine, a sound that resonated deep within their bones. Then, with a deafening roar, the cylinder ruptured. Metal shrieked and tore, and the chamber was filled with a blinding flash of light. Sarah and Ben instinctively shielded their eyes, their bodies bracing for the impact. When the light subsided, they cautiously lowered their hands and stared in disbelief at what stood before them. The cylinder was gone, reduced to a twisted heap of metal scraps. In its place, hovering in the air, was a swirling vortex of energy, a chaotic maelstrom of colors and light. It pulsed and writhed, crackling with raw power. What is that?" Ben stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah's eyes were wide with horror. I think that's the rift." The vortex expanded, its tendrils reaching out like grasping claws. The air around it grew colder, and a strange, ethereal wind whipped through the chamber. Sarah could feel a pull, a force that threatened to suck her into the swirling chaos. "We have to stop it," she said, her voice filled with urgency. "Before it gets any bigger." But how? Their weapons were useless against something like this. They were designed to kill men, not to fight against the fundamental forces of the universe. They were utterly outmatched. As if in answer to her unspoken question, a voice echoed through the chamber, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was Eleanor's voice, but distorted, amplified, as if filtered through some alien technology. Mark, Sarah, help me. The voice was weak, strained, barely audible above the roar of the swirling energy. But it was enough. It was enough to give them hope. It was enough to give them a direction. Eleanor! Mark shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. Where are you? What's happening? The voice responded, but its words were fragmented, garbled, almost unintelligible. Bridge, Montauk, experiment, gone wrong. Then silence. The voice was gone, swallowed by the chaos. Mark looked at Sarah, his face etched with concern. She's at Montauk. Something's happening there, something big. But how do we get there? Sarah asked, her voice filled with doubt. We're miles underground, and even if we could get out, we don't know what we're walking into. Mark hesitated. He knew she was right. They were in a precarious situation, but he couldn't abandon Eleanor. He wouldn't. We'll find a way, he said, his voice resolute. We have to. He turned his attention back to the swirling energy vortex. It was growing larger, more violent, threatening to consume everything in its path. They had to find a way to stabilize it, to shut it down. But how? He remembered something Eleanor had said, something about Caldwell's research, about his obsession with manipulating time and space. He remembered the diagrams she had shown him, the equations she had scribbled in her notebook. The frequency, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Caldwell was trying to manipulate the frequency of the universe. He thought he could control time and space by altering its fundamental vibrations. Sarah looked at him, her eyes wide with understanding. You think we can use that against him? You think we can disrupt the vortex by manipulating the frequency? It's our only chance, Mark said. He scanned the control panel, searching for the frequency modulator. It was a complex piece of equipment, covered in dials and switches. He had no idea how it worked. But he had to try. He started flipping switches, turning dials, experimenting with different settings. The vortex responded to his manipulations, its colors shifting, its intensity fluctuating. Careful, Sarah warned. You don't want to make it worse. Mark ignored her. He was focused on the frequency modulator, trying to find the right combination of settings. He felt like he was playing a game of cosmic roulette. One wrong move and they could all be destroyed. Suddenly he hit upon something. The vortex shuddered, its swirling energy momentarily subsiding. I think I've got it, he shouted. I think I've found a right frequency. He continued to fine-tune the settings, slowly but surely stabilizing the vortex. The swirling energy began to dissipate, its colors fading, its intensity diminishing. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the vortex collapsed, imploding upon itself in a flash of blinding light. The chamber was silent once more, the air still and heavy. They had done it. They had stabilized the vortex, but at what cost? Mark looked at Sarah, his face pale with exhaustion. Are you okay? I'm fine, she said, her voice shaky. But what about Eleanor? We still have to find her. I know, Mark said, and we will. But first, we need to get out of here. He started searching for an exit, his eyes scanning the walls for any sign of a door or passageway. He knew that Caldwell wouldn't have made it easy for them to escape, but he was determined to find a way. As he searched, he noticed something strange about the walls. They seemed to be shimmering, vibrating, as if they were made of some kind of liquid metal. He reached out and touched the wall, his fingers sinking into its surface. It felt warm, almost alive. "What is this stuff?" he muttered. Suddenly, the wall began to melt, dissolving before his very eyes. A doorway appeared, leading into a dark, unknown passage. "Well, that's convenient," Sarah said, her voice laced with sarcasm. "I wonder where that leads." Mark hesitated. He didn't trust it. It felt too easy. But they had no other choice. "Let's go," he said, his voice firm. "But be careful. We don't know what's waiting for us on the other side." He stepped through the doorway, Sarah close behind him. They entered the dark passage, their hearts pounding in their chests. They were one step closer to finding Eleanor, but they were also one step closer to the unknown. And the unknown was a very dangerous place to be. The passage sloped downwards, and as they walked, they heard a distant, rhythmic thumping, a sound that seemed to resonate deep within their bones. It was a sound that filled them with dread. It was the sound of Montauk. "Flashlights ready?" Ben asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah nodded, her beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. The air grew thick and heavy, laden with the musty scent of decay and something else, something metallic, like ozone after a lightning strike. "What is that smell?" Sarah questioned, wrinkling her nose. "Don't know," Ben replied, "but I don't like it." The thumping grew louder, more insistent. It was a deep, resonating pulse that seemed to vibrate through the very ground they walked on. They rounded a bend, and the passage opened into a vast chamber. The air shimmered with an almost visible energy. Before them stood a colossal machine, a tangle of wires, tubes, and glowing crystals. It was the source of the thumping, a rhythmic pulse emanating from its core. The machine was old, corroded, but still somehow alive. "What in God's name?" Sarah breathed, her voice filled with awe and terror. Ben stepped forward cautiously, his flashlight beam sweeping across the machine's intricate workings. This is beyond anything I've ever seen." Suddenly a voice echoed through the chamber. It was distorted, synthesized, but undeniably human. "You should not be here." Ben and Sarah whirled around, searching for the source of the voice. "Who's there?" Ben called out. "Show yourself." The voice chuckled, a chilling, artificial sound. "I am everywhere. I am the guardian. This place is forbidden." "We're looking for Eleanor Vance," Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly. "She came here. We just want to know if she's okay." "Eleanor Vance," the voice repeated, as if processing the name. "She sought forbidden knowledge. She trespassed where she did not belong." "Where is she?" Ben demanded, stepping closer to the machine. "What have you done with her?" The voice fell silent for a moment. Then it spoke again, its tone shifting, becoming almost mournful. "She is integrated, part of the whole. She sought to understand the nature of reality, and now she is one with it." Sarah gasped. "Integrated? What does that mean? Is she dead?" The voice did not answer directly. Instead, the machine began to hum louder, its rhythmic thumping intensifying. The air crackled with energy. "You must leave," the voice said, its tone urgent. Turn back now while you still can. This place is not meant for you. The knowledge it holds is too dangerous. Ben stood his ground, his face set in determination. We're not leaving without Eleanor. Tell us where she is. Show us what you've done to her. The machine pulsed, and a beam of light shot out, striking the wall beside Ben. The rock vaporized instantly, leaving a smoking crater. You have been warned, the voice boomed, echoing through the chamber. Turn back or face the consequences. Mark felt a surge of anger. He had come too far to be deterred by threats. He had to find Eleanor, no matter the cost. We're not afraid of you, he shouted, his voice filled with defiance. Show yourself. Let us see who's behind this. The machine whirred, its lights flashing erratically. The air grew thick with anticipation. Then, slowly, a figure began to materialize in the center of the chamber. It was a woman, tall and slender, with long, flowing hair. But there was something unnatural about her, something unsettling. Her skin was pale and translucent, and her eyes glowed with an eerie light. Eleanor, Mark whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. The woman turned to face him, her expression blank, devoid of emotion. I am no longer Eleanor, she said, her voice cold and distant. I am something more, something greater. What have they done to you? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. They have shown me the truth, Eleanor replied. The truth about the universe, about our place in it. They have given me the power to transcend human limitations. This isn't you, Eleanor, Mark pleaded. You can fight this. You can break free. Eleanor tilted her head, as if considering his words. Fight? Break free? Why would I want to do that? I have never been more alive, more aware. I have never felt so powerful. Caldwell stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with pride. She is the key, Mark, he said, the key to unlocking the secrets of the universe. With her, we can achieve anything. We can create a new world, a world without suffering, without death. A world without humanity, Sarah retorted, her voice filled with disgust. Caldwell waved his hand dismissively. Humanity is flawed, Sarah. It is weak. It is corrupt. It needs to be replaced. And Eleanor is the one who will lead the way. Mark knew he had to act fast. He couldn't let Caldwell complete his plan. He couldn't let Eleanor fall completely under his control. He looked around the chamber, searching for anything he could use to his advantage. His eyes landed on the energy conduits that ran along the walls. He remembered what Eleanor had said about the machine being unstable. If he could overload the system, he might be able to disrupt Caldwell's control and free Eleanor. He glanced at Sarah, silently communicating his plan. She nodded in understanding. Together, they moved towards the conduits, their hearts pounding with anticipation. Caldwell saw what they were doing and lunged forward to stop them. But Sarah was too quick. She tackled him to the ground, pinning him beneath her. "Do it, Mark," she shouted. Mark reached the first conduit and began to tamper with the controls. Sparks flew and the machine began to vibrate violently. Eleanor cried out in pain, clutching her head. "Stop!" Caldwell screamed, struggling to break free from Sarah's grasp. "You'll destroy everything." Mark ignored him and moved to the next conduit. He worked quickly, his hands shaking with adrenaline. The machine's lights flickered and the air crackled with energy. Eleanor's screams grew louder, more desperate. "Please, stop! I can't take it anymore." Mark hesitated for a moment, his heart filled with anguish. He didn't want to hurt Eleanor, but he knew it was the only way to save her. He took a deep breath and continued his work. With the final surge of power, the machine overloaded. A blinding flash of light filled the chamber, followed by a deafening explosion. The room shook violently, and debris rained down from the ceiling. When the light subsided, Mark looked around, his eyes searching for Eleanor. She was lying on the ground, unconscious. Caldwell was also unconscious, his face bruised and bloody. Sarah was standing beside him, her chest heaving. Mark rushed to Eleanor's side and gently shook her. "Eleanor, can you hear me?" Eleanor groaned and slowly opened her eyes. She looked at Mark, her expression confused. "Mark? What happened? Where am I?" "You're safe now," Mark said, his voice filled with relief. "It's over." Eleanor sat up, her head spinning. She looked around the chamber, her eyes wide with horror. "What have I done?" she whispered. "You didn't do anything," Mark said, taking her hand. "Caldwell did this to you. He manipulated you." Eleanor looked at Mark, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." "I know," Mark said, holding her close. "It's okay. We'll get through this together." They helped Eleanor to her feet and began to make their way out of the chamber. As they walked, Mark couldn't help but wonder about the knowledge that Caldwell had sought to unlock. Was it truly too dangerous for humanity, or could it be used for good? He didn't know the answer, but he knew one thing for sure. He would never forget what had happened in that forgotten lab. The experience had changed him, had shown him the depths of human ambition and the dangers of unchecked power. He knew that he had a responsibility to protect the world from those who would seek to exploit such knowledge for their own gain. They emerged from the underground facility into the cool night air, the weight of their experience settling upon them. The world outside seemed strangely normal, oblivious to the events that had just transpired. As they walked away, Mark glanced back at the entrance, a shiver running down his spine. He knew that the secrets of the Manhattan Project's forgotten labs would remain buried, a silent testament to the hubris of man. The world was safe for now, but the knowledge remained, waiting for someone else to unearth it. The cycle could begin again. He had to be ready. They all had to be ready. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe. Comment what you want to hear next. The drive back to the city was silent. Sarah stared out of the window, the city lights blurring into streaks of color. Mark kept glancing at her, concern etched on his face. "Are you all right?" he finally asked, his voice low. She turned to him, her eyes wide and haunted. "Did you see the way it moved?" "It wasn't human, Mark. It was something else entirely." He nodded grimly. "I saw it. We both did. That's why we have to keep this quiet. No one would believe us. They'd think we were crazy." Back in his apartment, Mark poured them both a stiff drink. The amber liquid burned a comforting path down his throat. "So what now?" Sarah asked, swirling the whiskey into glass. "Now," Mark said, his voice hardening, "we figure out who else knows about this, who else was involved, and we make damn sure they stay quiet." He pulled out his laptop, the glow illuminating his determined face. "I have contacts, people who know things. We'll start there." Days turned into weeks. They followed leads, chased whispers, and delved into the murky world of government secrets and classified documents. They discovered that the lab wasn't just abandoned, it was actively being suppressed. Files were missing, memories were erased, and anyone who got too close seemed to disappear. The closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous their situation became. One evening, as Mark was working late, a shadowy figure appeared in his doorway. "Looking for something," the figure rasped, a Glock pistol glinting in his hand. Mark slowly turned, his